Hello and welcome to Forgotten Fronts. In today's episode, we'll be playing the scenario, Mont Saint-Jean sans Infantry. But first, the history. If you don't want to hear the history, a time will come up on your screen. Wait for it! Get your hand away from that grubby mouse! Now! At 3:30, the French army reeled from the failed attack of Droulin's corps. In the meantime, Napoleon reads the reports of the Prussian movement, saying that elements of the Prussian 4th Corps would arrive on the field by 4 p.m. At the same time, he received the 11:30 dispatch from Grouchy, dashing any hope of reinforcement, so Napoleon ordered Ney to attack the Allied centre, then left to oversee the defence of Plassanois. Ney then gathered two of the most serviceable brigades of Droulin's corps to make another attack on the Haisson, while the Grand Battery focused their bombardment on the right centre. However, Bering pushed back the assault on the farmhouse. Despite this, the bombardment did not cease, and the Duke of Wellington ordered his battalions on the ridge back 100 paces and to lie down. Ney, upon seeing the failure of the attack from the high point along the French ridge, which allowed him to see just behind the Allied ridge. Looking along the Allied line, what he saw exhilarated him. Barely being able to see the Allied army in the smoke and likely suffering from PTSD, transformed the repositioning battalions, convoys of wounded and escorted prisoners, ammunition wagons and deserters, moving to the Force de Saint-Jean into Wellington's retreat. Ney, impulsive by nature and wanting to redeem his performance at Quatre Bras, gathered 900 cuirassiers from the 5th and 10th cuirassiers under Pierre Ferrand Ducreux, and ordered them to attack the Allied right centre. The orders were scarcely given when the division commander, Delort, halted them, stating that the move was not prudent over such muddy terrain, starting an argument between himself and Ney and Milhaud, the commander of the 4th Cavalry Corps, which only led Ney to order the entirety of Milhaud's cavalry corps forward. Milhaud, caught up in the excitement, obeyed and returned to his formation, shaking hands with Lefebvre-Desnouettes, the commander of the light cavalry of the guard, saying, "We are going to charge! Support us!" Believing this to be an order from the Emperor, he obeyed, and the attack expanded to 5,000 cavalry. It was now 4 p.m. and the cavalry lined up checkerwise on the 1,000-yard front, Ney at the head with the cuirassiers on the right and the light cavalry on the left. The cavalry advanced up the ridge on the left side of the Charleroi road on a slight right oblique. The charge was rushed and ill-prepared, but Ney believed that courage and passion could drive the men through any hardship. This revealed several major flaws. The right side of the ridge was hidden from large parts of the artillery, sparing many of the Allied squares. The attack was made on part of the Allied line which was not attacked, which Wellington had recently reinforced, seeing the massing French cavalry. The formation of the French cavalry was vulnerable to artillery and skirmisher fire. Eventually, as the cavalry ascended the ridge, they halted the fire of the Grand Battery, stopping any suppression of the Allied artillery and skirmishers. The cavalry was slowed in the muddy ground. Flanking fire from the farms forced the ranks closer together into squadron columns 820 yards long and 82 yards deep, which only helped to slow the charge further. Ney alone lost 4 horses in the charges, that being 4 main charges and 12 other charges. But historians agree that the most damning of all was that no infantry or artillery was committed to support this assault. As the cavalry crested the ridge, they encountered 20 squares in a 2-line checker pattern, and the Allies unleashed volleys of musketry and canister fire. By 5:30, 4 main charges were made by Milhaud and Lefebvre-Desnouettes. However, 2 were made by the 3rd Corps Cavalry under Kellerman and Guyot's Dragoons of the Guard and Horse Grenadiers, who were deployed to extract the other cavalry, bringing the engagement to 10,000 horsemen. The second wave was packed so tight that horses were lifted off the ground. The only cavalry spared this engagement were 800 carabiniers and a Blanchard, who were ordered by Kellerman to hold their position by Hougoumont unless given orders directly from him. They would be the last of the cavalry reserve in the battle that day. After the battle, Napoleon attempted to disassociate himself with the charge, attempting to say it was done without his authorization or done too soon. A thousand hearts beat in anticipation as they scanned the ridge, their swallowtail pennants flapping in the wind. Waiter yells to Traverse's squadron that during the charge they would be under independent command. Turning to give a similar command to Dubois, Waiter's head is joined by several others in his division as a courier pounds through the mud towards him, his arm held aloft, a dispatch fluttering in the wind. As the courier arrived, he handed him the now muddy dispatch from Milhaud to charge the ridge and block the road, cutting the Allied retreat. Waiter salutes the courier and then sends him back on his way to Milhaud. Then he turns to Dubois, giving him the same orders as Travers. Waiter then pulls a telescope out of his tunic and looks along the ridgeline and sees all the Allied artillery along the ridge unlimber their guns, struggling against the sucking mud. Moving to the head of his division, he gave the order to his men to draw swords, and the buglers of his squadron echoed his orders. All along the line, the sound of heavy swords being drawn was heard. Travers, moving to the head of his squadron, drew his sword, lifting it in the air, shining in the sun for a moment, then dropped it to point out the ridge and yelled to his men, "Avancez! Pour France et pour l'Empereur!" His men replied, "Pour l'Empereur!" The cuirassiers trotted up the muddy slope by the Chateau Hougoumont, squelching in the muddy slurry. As his troops stepped off, a great thunder and smoke came to the crest of the ridge as the Allied artillery opened fire on the massed cavalry. Cannonballs and howitzer shells sallied through the air, crashing into the ground, throwing up great clouds of earth as they exploded among the massed cavalry. The Grand Battery answered in an almost simultaneous blast, further darkening the sky with a wall of sulphuric smoke. A few shells exploded over the ridge like white fireworks, but there would be no celebrations as they released hot iron fragments into the Allied forces below. Dubois ordered the 2nd Squadron of the 4th Cuirassier Regiment forward to the garden of La Haisson to clear them of enemy skirmishers to make sure they do not fire to the flank of the formation. The leader of the 2nd stood in his saddle, looking through the hedges for any sign of the skirmishers, but then he spotted a small garden in the trees, and the bugler ordered the advance. The leader crossed himself, then drew his sword, pointing it to the hedges. While they advanced, unbloodied and eager, the men of the 2nd followed the sound of the screaming bugle. The cuirassiers galloped to the far side of the orchard by the Charleroi road, moving by the road to block the escape of anybody who took cover in the woods. The horses' lungs rasped like bellows as they almost flew toward the Charleroi road. Then the cuirassiers burst through the hedgerows, crushing them in their wakes. As a shell exploded overhead and iron fragments and branches rained down on the men, clattering on their helmets and breastplates. He began to smolder as hot shrapnel fell through his branches. This alerted the nearby regiment, and another bugle sounded, and the Germans rushed to other trees facing the oncoming cuirassier. Bugler then called the charge, and the squadron broke up, charging among the trees, the German skirmishers scattering among the same trees, running for cover. As the cavalry moved in the orchard, they flung sticks and mud in the air. As they charged, men screamed, not in pain, but in the thrill of the charge. The cavalrymen charged across the front of the skirmishers' formation. As soon as they arrived, the rifles ran from the force, some of them dropping their hats and backpacks, amongst other heavy equipment. The pentecock caught in the tree branches as the bearer attempted to level it like a lance. The bearer then panicked as the black horses surrounded them, cutting down a number of his fellows nearby. Surprisingly, he was able to rip it free, and then ran with it to the edge of the garden, saving it from certain capture. As the cavalry reached the edge of the garden, the cavalry carved through the ranks of straggling skirmishers. The skirmishers ran for their lives outside of the orchard. As they left the hedgerows, they fanned out by the Charleroi road. The cavalry followed their prey closely. However, as they left the garden, the cannon fire became more intense as the cannonballs screeched by, taking the upper body off an unfortunate private. We burst from the hedgerows, pursuing the fugitive skirmishers, who fled in panic, dropping their heavy equipment, until a cannonball screeched into our ranks, and the screams of men and beasts were soon drowned out by the bugle of retreat. The heavy cavalry pursued the German skirmishers with their heavy blades until a cannonball cut through the air, putting a hole in the breastplate of their commander. The commander slumped to the ground, not knowing what hit him. The squadron of cuirassiers, upon seeing the fate of their commander, withdrew. The cavalry jumped back over the barricade, all the while the garrison of the farmhouse fired upon them. A horse was left dying on the barricade, unable to get up, lifting its head, seeing all the chaos around it. Its screams were finally ended when a German skirmisher in the farmhouse put it out of its misery with a single shot. Then in the center of the line, notes of a bugle signaled the cavalry's advance on the ridge. As the cavalry advanced, they pulverized the last evidence of the crops of rye in the center of the ridge. Mud flecked and slapped the faces and armor of the men. The riders squinted to keep the mud from their eyes, whooping and raising their swords in the air. In the center of this advancing formation, Travers attempts to move his squadron onto the batteries behind Hougoumont. However, Travers' squadron is almost swept away by the other squadrons. The cannonballs flying all around and the shells exploding overhead, only adding to the confusion that threatened to stop him accomplishing this. Travers eventually ordered his men to reorganize into a battle line at the double. His squadron advanced, dodging the others who cursed at them for getting in their way or calling them cowards for turning back. As 3 of the troops arrived, Travers ordered the advance. This was amplified by the bugler's nose, but his instrument was drowned out by the thundering of hooves and the explosion of shells. And so Travers waved his sword in the air, gleaming in the sun, which caught the attention of the squadron, but also the Allied gunners, who began to pour shells in their direction. Travers ignored this bombardment as he lowered the point of the sword to the back right corner of the garden by Hougoumont. Some of the cavalrymen were confused by this, but others moved towards the direction he was pointing. The other cavalrymen eventually followed, and soon the entire squadron was moving towards the garden of Hougoumont.
Avancez, men! Pull off for us! Sweep those guns from the ridge!
Where are you going, men? Where are you going? To the farmhouse! To the farmhouse! Stand up now! Hand me the guidon! Follow me! With the standard in hand, Travers directs his squadron up the ridge on a nearby road in a slow but deliberately steady trot. Travers points his sword up the ridge towards a battery of British cannon and howsers to the right of Huguenot Orchard. However, a squadron of Guard Grenadier and Dragoons burst from the orchard, crushing the hedges that line the orchard in their wake. Though Travers halted his squadron, the men complained of the sudden stop and the heave on the reins of their horses, likewise whinnied in their complaints to their riders. Travers shouted his protests. They were barely audible over the incessant roar of battle, and the low thunder like reverberations of the ground beneath the simultaneous tread of so many horses. The other commander shouted that his squadron was in the wrong section of the ridge, and he and his troops should return to the right flank. Then his squadron rushed out in front, blocking any way for them to defy this order from that officer. The exasperated Travers halted his squadron, giving back the color to his bearer, then waving his sword over his head, pointed it to the corner of the orchard. The bugler then sounded the call to advance at the gallop, and the squadron proceeded forward. The sun rippled off their armor and swords, all the while the cavalrymen braved the hail of shot and shell. This iron sleet, however, caused little perceptible check to their progress, and with shouts of "Vive l'Empereur!" they accelerated their pace up the road that went behind the chateau. As Travers' squadron crested the ridge, the Grenadiers and Dragoons to their right charged the bridge battery, and Travers wished his men and commander luck. The entire squadron crested the ridge in one moment. The gunners immediately abandoned their pieces, but it was no matter. As our horses passed the guns, we cut left and right at the gunners, easily overwhelming them. One of them in my path had his head cleaved entirely in two, not knowing what hit him. The bugler then sounded the charge, and the squadron obeyed, rushing forth wildly towards the Dutch battery on the crest of the ridge. The first troops surged forth to the mad bugle call, men screaming as though drunk, pointing their swords forward and reaching for their pistols and carbines. As the cavalry arrived, the gunners ran to the nearest squares or threw themselves to the muddy ground under their large guns. The huge horsemen quickly overran the first gun battery, and the cavalrymen cut left and right at the gunners, who were nearly defenseless. Then the square opened fire, and the face of the square disappeared in smoke, and the cavalry faced a hail of iron beating on their helmets and breastplates. Some of the balls found their mark, and a cuirassier was hit in the jaw, gobbling something unintelligible as he fell from his horse, who ran back to their line. After overrunning the last of the battery, Travers ordered his squadron to regroup along the road that they advanced up, to prepare for another charge against the batteries behind the chateau. The nearby Allied forces took advantage of this to fire upon them with canister and musket volleys. The 1st and 2nd Squadron of the 12th Cuirassiers charged the battery. The gunners frantically tried to limber up their guns and escape, but the 2 squadrons of cavalry charged the battery and easily overwhelmed 2 of the guns, then the 3rd. The 2nd Squadron of the 7th Cuirassiers got lost in the smoke and charged the guard square. The 2 squadrons of the 12th Cuirassiers continued to run down the battery, then the gunners abandoned their pieces by the road to take shelter within the guard square. The 3rd Battalion of Foot Guards formed square while the Coldstream Guard just in front of them ran, too slow to draw the long clumsy blades which were their bayonets. The commander galloped over to the chaotic mob that was the formation to rally them. The 12th Cuirassiers eventually overran the battery. The 2 squadrons of the 7th Cuirassiers were pushed back by the heavy fire of the guard square which the squadron first encountered. Eventually this rampage was brought to an end as many of the horsemen lay dead or dying in the field, and they were driven back. After their failed charge, the 2nd Squadron of the 7th Cuirassiers rallied and made their way to the battery. To the right of the chateau, our confused squadron reformed to make another charge at the guns by our commander, now in a quickly made-up sling that cradled his arm. The guns just beyond him were lined up for an easy charge, and one of our fellows let out a joking "Yoo-hoo!" mocking us in chills. As the 2 squadrons of the 12th Cuirassier withdrew, in the meantime, the 2nd Squadron of the 7th Cuirassier began their advance to the battery. All the while, the men of the 2nd Squadron of the 7th Cuirassiers were charging the battery to avenge the 12th Squadron, who were pulling back. Travers, in the meantime, looked on the fleeing 12th Cuirassier Squadron in rage, waving his sword and yelling at them, "Come back, you cowards! Your actions shame the Emperor!" Eventually heeding their cries, not wanting to be outdone by the other squadron, the men of the 1st Squadron of the 12th Cuirassier rallied and charged the battery once again. Then the gunners quickly busied themselves by making their guns ready to fire, but it was too late, and a great hurrah came from the iron-clad horsemen as they advanced on the gunners, and so the gunners flung themselves under their guns once again. However, there was not enough room for all the men, and so a desperate shoving match occurred until some of them gave up and attempted to run for the squares as best they could. However, this was futile, and many of the gunners were cut down in their wake by saber or gun. Some of the gunners of the left and center section managed to limber their guns in time and began to ride away. Slowed by the mud, the gunners with the back of their horses bloody as they attempted to escape. Despite this, the cuirassiers fired upon the fleeing gunners. Some of the unfortunate gunners grabbed for their chests and slumped over, falling from their limbers with horrible screams. The cavalry chased the now two batteries withdrawing from the cannon. However, the cavalry easily caught up with the fleeing gunners, cutting down the drivers and halting the cannon. Upon capturing a gun, a messenger arrived from Travers, furious that the squadron had gone so far away from the others, in doing so exposing themselves to the allied cavalry who waited behind the squares. On the other side of the field, Travers reorganizes his squadron along the path which they had originally charged up, gathering three of the closest squadrons and ordering them to retire down the ridge to the right side of the chateau. The Guard Dragoons and Grenadiers make another unsuccessful charge up the ridge, a trend that is being repeated all along the ridge where the cavalry still attack. The musket fire and grape shot cut down the cavalry like grass to a mower's side, the ground now being piled with corpses. By Hougoumont, Dubois' squadron advanced up the ridge. One of the squadrons was pushed back due to the rifle fire from the Haisson. Dubois ordered the bugler to tell the squadron to move forward at the right oblique, pointing his sword to reinforce the order. But then, seeing how disorganized the squadron was, Dubois ordered the squadron to halt and reorganize in the battle line, moving more to the center of the valley. All the while, cannonballs whistled overhead, plowing into the ground around them, sweeping the legs off horses who squealed in gut-wrenching pain. As almost all the regiments got into position, Dubois pointed his sword forward to the battery on the crest of the ridge. The other members of the squad also raised their swords and yelled out battle cries as they ascended the ridge. As the horsemen thundered up the ridge, the thunder of allied cannon drowned them out. Balls cut great bloody channels into the tightly packed formation, filled in an instant. The wounded horses slithered in the mud or shook as they tried to get up with broken legs. A cannonball shattered the blade of a cuirassier's sword, ripping his arm off. The stump spurted blood as the rider screamed. The remnants of the sword flew into the faces of the other men behind them. The squadron then galloped up the muddy ridge, their horses' light covered almost entirely in. As Dubois' squadron approached the crest of the ridge, a lone rider rushes back, his crimson uniform showing that he is division commander of the Allied army and part of the King's German Legion. However, this powerful man, upon seeing the approach of the Emperor's big brothers, fled toward the battery and nearby brigade. Seeing this, Dubois waves his sword in the air, pointing it in the direction of the withdrawing officer, and his squadron obeyed. As the 4th Squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers charged the ridge, they came under a heavy fire from the riflemen of Le Haisson. The gunners, upon hearing the thundering hooves of the cavalry, loaded their cannon and with double canister, doing so as men whose lives depended on it, and waited until the cavalry crested the ridge. As the cavalry crested the ridge, the two guns of the far right battery fired. The guns unleashed a swarm of grape and smoke, blotting out any evidence of the cavalry except for the streams of horse and men. However, this didn't stop the charge of the 1st and 2nd Squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers. The gunners frantically attempted to limber the cannons. Then the bugler of the 2nd Squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers saw this, and broke into the charge, caught up in the excitement, doing so without orders. Seeing the charge of the cavalry, the 1st Light Battalion of the King's German Legion formed quickly into square. The Allied guns had time to limber their pieces and began to run as the cavalry was slowed too much by the mud. One of the guns was too slow to do this and was overwhelmed by the cavalry. The gunners were cut down if they did not make it to the squares. At the same time, the other battalions of the King's German Legion formed into square. The gunners begged to be let in, but the legionnaires didn't want to compromise the square, and so they sent the gunners away. Now blocked by the squares of the King's German Legion acting like a fence, Dubois recalled his squadron to the Charleroi road. Before they were able to reorganize along the road, the 1st Squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers captured one more gun before the squadron joined the others. With the approaching of the cavalry, the 95th Rifles turned, fixing their longsword bayonets and opened fire. Enraged by the riflemen, the 2nd Squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers charged them, but as soon as their commander was hit in the neck and blood turned his uniform front red, the squadron withdrew. Seeing this, the 1st Squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers charged, and the riflemen scrambled out of the sandpit as they ran. Then there was a shout of alarm from Wellington's staff as the heavy cavalry came thundering towards them, howling with their swords in the air. His staff abandoned the oak tree which the Duke had commanded since the beginning of the battle. The appearance of the cavalry was certainly enough to inspire a feeling of great dread. As they got near, the earth seemed to vibrate. This was the only moment when my calm demeanor was near to shattering. The men of the 4th Squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers charged, their hoofs clattering across the cobblestones of the Charleroi road towards the battery. The gunners loaded and fired their pieces with astonishing speed. However, their shot were too quickly aimed and most went high, missing the cavalry or taking off the heads of the riders. The cavalrymen then charged the guns, narrowly missing their supply wagon. Their driver, being careful not to draw too much attention to himself, slumped over and prayed that the cavalrymen would think him killed. The cavalry moved around him like water flowing around a rock in a river. The men of the 33rd and the nearby squadron of serrated steel fired a volley from one of its faces, blanketing it in smoke, bringing half the squadron to the ground. Some were killed, more were wounded, but by far the greater part were thrown over the dead and wounded. However, the bugler still hurled them into the slaughter, his fellows screaming all the way. This did not stop the squadron, who proceeded to capture 2 more of the Allied guns. The squadron only then briefly halted to reorganize. All the while, the muskets of the 33rd fired steadily and relentlessly, flames spearing through the smoke, spewing shot into the formation, hitting the face of one of the men, blood running down his face, and hitting the 2 legs of one of the horses, who fell howling in pain, throwing its rider and breaking his leg. The 3rd squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers were formed on the road, and their commander, yelling reassuring words to his men, pointed his sword forward towards the 95th Rifles farther down the road. The grasshoppers ran to the large Dutch Belgian brigade for their support. The 1st squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers made a far riskier charge toward the entirety of the Dutch Belgian brigade. As they began to gallop forth, the 3rd squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers began to gallop past the road to another battery of Allied guns, who unloaded their canister upon them. The cuirassiers raised their swords over their heads, piercing the smoke, their faces as black as chimney sweeps, only helping to exaggerate the wild eyes of the riders, lit up only by the fire of muskets of the Dutch-Belgian squares. The men of the Dutch-Belgian brigade formed a fortress of squares, but this did not stop the 1st squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers. Then the great ironclad cavalry charged us. The men's muskets shivered as they saw the onslaught. We fired a volley and hit one of the horses who plowed through our ranks, breaking the square. As the cavalrymen jumped over the felled horse and my regiment broke. The 1st squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers charged the Dutch militia at a full gallop, shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" with all their souls. The Dutch square soon completely blown away and dwindled into a mere clump. The 3rd squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers charged the Allied battery. The gunners immediately scattered for the 2 nearby English squares. The gunners of one of the pieces was able to keep steady long enough to unleash a storm of canister into the advancing troop of cavalry. Those who were shot dead were fortunate, for the wounded horses, struggling in the mud, plunging and kicking, soon finished off the gunners' work after the squadron retreated. The 3rd squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers captured many of the guns of the Allied battery, all the while under fire from the squares, throwing back their charges, saving the final gun of the battery. While this occurred, the 1st squadron of the 4th Cuirassiers finished their approach to the 95th Rifles and charged them. The commander of the 3rd squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers waved his sword in the air and managed to reorganize his squadron along the road and to spur them into action, ordering a full charge on the final gun of the battery. The 1st squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers also managed to reorganize, but in contrast moved to the sandpit where the rifles began the battle. The 3rd squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers approached the last gun of the battery, shouting as loud as they could bawl. In the meantime, the 1st squadron of the 4th Cuirassiers, after alarming so many Allied officers, came under heavy fire from 2 nearby squares, and horses fell quivering in the mud. Soon it became too much for the squadron, and they withdrew. Eventually, the 3rd squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers broke into a charge, the riders weaving in between the withdrawing squadron. As they arrived, the heavy cavalry easily overran the gunners, who ran behind the English squares. My squadron! What has become of them? Their shining breastplates in the sun as they passed me by, disappearing in the smoke, and I saw them no more. They are finished. I am finished. I can never return to France with this shame. Seeing the limited success of the charge compared to his losses, the commander ordered the bugler to sound the recall. Despite the nearby easy targets out with the unorganized retreating rifles and the King's German Legion battalions and column nearby, as the notes rang out, the Allies, upon hearing this, began to jeer and pull faces at the withdrawing cavalry. The men in the square were soon quieted by their sergeants, who ordered them to open fire on the withdrawing cavalry, which they did. The men then busied themselves, pulling back the heavy flints with their bleeding fingers, and ramrods clattering in their hot blackened barrels. Their fire flashed red in the great clouds of smoke that surrounded them, the cuirassiers, horses and men, falling screaming and quivering. A cuirassier was hit in the thigh and fell from his horse and was dragged into one of the squares and quickly bayoneted. His armor and valuables were quickly pilfered by the soldiers. Desperate for revenge on the men lost on the muddy trodden ground of the ridge, the men of the 3rd squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers looked about them for targets as they continued to withdraw. As they do so, they see the most tempting target of all, the leader of the Allied army, the Duke of Wellington. Seeing this as the perfect revenge, the 3rd squadron of the 1st Cuirassiers were galloping, sword in hand, charging forward, toward their uniforms flecked with blood and mud. In response to this, the sepoy general runs back, and pieces of paper fly from a small wooden table and a saddle used to write dispatches. The nearby English square calls out to the general to ride to them and to goad the French cavalry onto their bayonets and shot. However, the cuirassiers were just out of range of the English square, and they could only sit and watch, horrified. The heavy cavalry thundered up the muddy cobblestones of the Charleroi road. The Duke fled, thundering towards the Prince of Orange, his famous bicorn hat gone, and his blue coat stained with mud, and normal coolness nowhere to be seen. His Majesty waited in place, his gaudy uniform befitting of his status, as the Duke fled for his life. It is unknown why his Majesty did not also run, for long after the Duke passed him, he was captured by the cuirassiers.
Ha! Looks like the young frog has been captured. I say let the French have him. We're better off without the likes of him.
Despite capturing the Prince of Orange, the 3rd Squadron of the 1st Cuirassier were pushed back, all the while under fire from the English squares. A horse nearby limped down the ridge, dragging his rear legs, dripping in blood and whinnying pitifully. Enraged by the disobedient troop, Dubois orders his entire squadron down the ridge, looking for the other squadrons under his command to return. Among the men wandering through the squares was a cuirassier who, after putting his horse out of his misery, struggled to unbuckle and drag the expensive saddle from the horse. Eventually, when the cuirassier was able to pull free the expensive saddle from his dead mount, the nearby squares gave him an ironic cheer as he walked head-bowed down the ridge. On the other side of the ridge, Travers takes a brass telescope out of his tunic, unfolds it, and looks over the ridge at the Allied battalions. Travers looked for places to charge to finally break the Allied line. Waiter did the same thing behind Travers, taking out his telescope and wiping it from a layer of gunpowder that covered the lens like dust, looking to redeem the loss of Dubois' squadron to the Emperor. Both of the commanders look to the flanks of the Allied line, but know nothing about the center of the line. Waiter then leans forward to do some reconnaissance, seeing a squadron of Horse Guard Grenadiers making an attack in the sector he wanted to see. On seeing this, Travers speaks loudly so his words can be overheard in the thundering cannon and said that he was too important to lose and volunteered himself to go, taking one of his squadrons as personal protection, which Waiter reluctantly agreed. At the same moment, the Horse Guard Grenadiers make another suicidal attack on the squares, and one of the attacking troops is pushed back. Then Travers gallops up to the 2nd Squadron of the 12th Cuirassier to escort him up the ridge for his reconnaissance, and their commander agrees. Then the commander and the squadron move up the muddy ridge once again. As Travers and the squadron ascend the ridge, Waiter orders the rest of the troops back to keep them out of the Allied cannon bombardment. As Travers arrived at the crest of the ridge, 2 squadrons of the Horse Guard Grenadiers make another attack on the squares, as shells explode in the air, raining shrapnel on the cavalry. Hundreds of men and horses lay in bloody heaps all along the ridge, which one soldier later wrote, the steam from which looked like a burning wet haystack. Trying to shelter his head with his arms and involuntarily flinching as shrapnel fizzed by, distracted the commander who did not see his surroundings. Travers took out his telescope once again to look over the Allied position, every now and then ducking as bullets from the nearby Allied squares cracked overhead, some hitting the nearby grenadiers. Then looking behind the squares, he saw rank upon rank of Allied light cavalry casually waiting for the order to advance. As he halted, he was horrified at the makeshift bastion of corpses of men and horses that surrounded the squares.
Looking around the ridge, what I saw is now burnt into my nightmares. The butchered remains of the finest cavalry of the Empire, their glorious riders now in human-shaped hunks of meat surrounded by their wounded. It was pitiful to see the agony of the poor horses, and the agonizing groans of the dying and wounded riders was most appalling.
As Travers continues to look over the point of the ridge through his increasingly dirty telescope, the Horse Guard Grenadiers make another attack on the ridge, this time at the trot as the horses were tired from the charge up the muddy ridge. Despite the cavalrymen wrenching on the horses' reins, but the horses could not be forced into the squares, so the ragged fire of the guardsmen brought down a great many horsemen that the formation halted and withdrew. The sound of the balls hitting the Grenadiers were like dull, wet thuds. This was soon joined by splats as the Grenadiers fell to the muddy ground. After that came the sickening crunches and screams as the formation withdrew over their dead and wounded. Another squadron, seeing and hearing the bugler of the other squadron sound the withdrawal, followed suit despite the yells of their nearby commander. The Grenadier squadron began to melt away as Travers ordered the 2nd Squadron of the 12th Cuirassiers to fall back a few hundred paces to avoid the square's fire. All the while, shells screamed overhead and exploded, raining hot iron shrapnel on the cavalry. Despite the failure of the 2 other troops and they and their commander withdrawing, the last squadron of the Horse Guard Grenadiers advanced on the ridge under fire from another foot guard square. Seeing the squadron fail in their charge, Travers had seen enough, and so he and the 2nd Squadron of the 12th Cuirassier withdrew down the ridge once again. As the Cuirassier retreat, armor clattered and mud splattered the underbelly of their mounts. The riderless horses attempted to join the withdrawing cavalry, and some of the redcoats rushed out of the squares to grab the reins for the high reward. On the far side of the ridge, the 3rd Squadron of the 4th Cuirassier had regrouped halfway up the ridge. They attempted to deal with their wounded and looked on horrified at the disintegration of their squadron. Then a galloping sound breaks their concentration, and the second-in-command looks over to see an approaching courier. When the courier arrives, he gives the second-in-command an order from Dubois to withdraw down the ridge to the other squadrons. Seeing that their little squadron would have little effect on its own after the destruction of the entire squadron, they complied. In the center of the ridge, Travers and the 2nd Squadron of the 12th Cuirassiers moved to the center of the ridge to continue their reconnaissance of the Allied position. Now they approached the position of the Nassauers in the center of the ridge. Not knowing how long the disastrous attack would be allowed to continue, Travers and the 2nd Squadron of the 12th Cuirassiers moved to them at the double. As the cavalry ascended the ridge, their armor clanks and the last evidence of the rye crops quickly sank into the muddy ground. The men rested their heavy sabers on their shoulder as they advanced. Travers wondered what the farmers would do after the battle was over, but his thoughts quickly returned to his orders. The grenadiers, in their current passion, moving to make another charge on the foot-guard squares, called them cowards or without honor to flee to another part of the ridge. In the meantime, Dubois orders the remaining squadrons in the vicinity farther back, out of the range of the Allied cannon. As Travers and the 2nd Squadron of the 12th Cuirassiers arrived by the Nassauers' position, they were greeted by a nervous officer who hailed them, his face almost friendly as he trotted up to accept their surrender. The Cuirassiers responded with insults, one even pointing his saber at the man and threatened to charge, and was followed by the commander forcing the Allied officer to flee. The officer was on a swift animal and managed to withdraw behind the battalions of his brigade, and so the Cuirassiers halted with the way blocked by so many Allied squares. After they advanced, the gallant horsemen were exposed to the fire of the cannon of the Allied army, who were on level with the slope of the hill. Balls tore through the ranks, causing at each discharge great bloody gaps to show themselves in the Cuirassiers' rank. Tearing a sergeant in two and taking the arm off a man just above the elbow, he grabbed onto one of his comrades, bleeding all over his uniform. Other cannonballs splattered in the mud around the squadron, kicking up great hunks of mud and water that splashed over the cavalrymen. Then Travers took out his telescope once again to look over the Allied position. Some of the battalions behind the squares were in line, but the squares were too close and threatened to cut down the cavalry like grass to a mower's scythe. Farther on the right, there were more battalions to the right in square. There were also cannons in between the squares, blasting away at the French army on the other side of the ridge. As the cannonballs and shells flew through the air, they left lines across the sky. Every now and then, Travers sent couriers back with hastily written notes of his findings that almost as soon as they left on their horses, notes immediately became wet and muddy. Now a rock or shrapnel or whatever such thing in the battlefield hit the lens of the telescope in such a way that a crack formed down the center of it, rendering the device useless. To the left there were two more English battalions, likewise in square, blocking the way to French victory. As Travers sat and looked at the Allied battalions, their officer rushed to the front and ordered them to fire upon them, but the smoke was too thick and the ridge covered the majority of the cavalry, so the squares held their fire. The line between the squares made ready, but did not wheel to encourage the cavalry to charge. The Allied cannon continues to fire on the cavalry, and a shell exploded overhead. By now the horses and men were nervous, not seeing the point of rushing up to the ridge, endangering themselves to shell fire for no reason. Fiercely and fatally did the iron hail rattle against the helmeted and steel-clad cuirassiers, here glancing off, there penetrating the armor, wounding or laying prostrate many a gallant warrior. Being this, Travers attempted to rally them, promising them this would be the last point of the ridge they would check before returning to safety. But just after doing so, the squadron ran farther down the ridge, led by a sergeant who was their last commander. Enraged, Travers followed them down the ridge, and finally got them to retreat by the garden of the Haisson. As they arrived, they saw heaps of what Travers presumed to be the dead and wounded of Dubois' squadron. As they saw them, they called out to him, reaching out. Neighs mixed with curses and wails of rage and pain as the wounded men breathed their last. But the nearby Allied square had prevented him to get near, or he would be easily shot by them. The men in the square looked grimly forward, sneering at him, revealing bad teeth, as if challenging him to charge the square. The blue colors looked over them, fluttering gloriously in the wind. The square was like an island in an archipelago of writhing dead and wounded in a sea of blood, many of them not having the strength to get up in their weakened state. No actual dash was made upon them, as no horse could be forced to charge the square. Travers looking to the squares to his front, his horse nervously shuffling from side to side, splashing the nearby puddles. He reached down and petted its neck and whispering to it, "I agree, mon ami, but I must be strong in front of the men." Meanwhile, behind Hougoumont, one of the foot-guard squares stood after many charges from the heavy cavalry. In one of the corners of the square lay many dead, as the flanks were exposed in the corners of the squares, leaving the men vulnerable. And every now and then an individual more daring than the rest would ride up to the square and shoot or slice at the man in the corner. But the suicidal attempt to break the square came at great risk, and many French cavalry lay dead there as well. However, the square still held defiantly against a horde of cavalry. Not far from them another squadron of the Horse Guard Grenadiers advanced, but were exposed on a considerable space by the destructive fire of the Allied guns and musketry. Their order was somewhat broken, their courage was not shaken. To the front of the advancing squadrons were piles of men who attempted to charge before them, some calling out for aid or yelling for the squadrons to not charge. Others in the piles of men and horses that stretched across the ridge could not call out, as they were already dead. Suddenly Travers was once again snapped back to reality as a shell explodes overhead, pouring a destructive shower of shrapnel amidst the devoted ranks. Many of the horses in the ranks whinnied and reared in fear, but many of the riders managed to calm them. A private had a sickly wet cough as blood spurted from a wound in his neck and then came out of his mouth. The horse galloped off, his eye taken out by shrapnel, the rider holding on for dear life until he fell, weighed down by his armor. Travers turned to the bugler, who now put the instrument to his lips once again and began to sound the withdraw. Upon hearing this, the wounded became more desperate, grabbing onto the horse's leg and screaming out for the men. The more heartbreaking of all were those who dragged themselves towards the cavalrymen, unable to walk. But the wounded could not keep up with the cavalrymen, or had their hands and wrists broken by the horses as they left to join the other cavalry squadrons. The squadron eventually left, leaving the screaming wounded behind, reaching out in desperation. After his thoughts of regret of leaving the wounded behind, Travers wondered how the defeat of the cavalry would affect Napoleon's defeating the Prussians, especially if the reports were true that Travers only now vaguely remembered after so many charges. Wader at the same time wondered what the cavalry would do if the Prussians or Allied made a cavalry assault on Napoleon's army, though he knew the infantry could form squares to great effect like the Allies. As Wader looks upon the ridge, the horse-guard grenadiers are forced back as cannonballs fall around them in rapid succession, throwing up massive clods of mud. The brave squadron, one of the last squadrons on the ridge, fell back, muddy and bloody, as their commander watched in disbelief as the gallant charge of his men are pushed back. After withdrawing, the men of the 2nd Squadron of the 12th Cuirassiers lose cohesion and break, as they did not want to charge the ridge once again. Seeing the situation, Travers turns and swears to his men on his life that they would not advance up the ridge again this day. The other side of the ridge by La Haye-Saint, the Dutch-Belgian brigade had formed their line towards the farmhouse, leaving the flank vulnerable to the Grand Battery. By the crossroads, 3 squares dared not to leave their bastion of defense from the enemy cavalry. The rallying cries of Travers helped the majority of them to regroup, but the most desperate of the formations still spurred their horses to flee in multiple directions. At the same time, Wader at the bottom of the ridge looked through his telescope at the rear of Hougomont, hoping to make another flanking attack, but the reports from Travers of the Allied cavalry quickly stopped this foolish plan. Then Wader summoned 2 couriers to ride to his troop commanders to revoke their independent command and ordered the shattered remains of his division farther back. One of the unfortunate grenadiers, bleeding profusely from his chest as he lay on the ridge, looked up from where he lay and saw line upon line of Allied cavalry in his fading vision. The charge was doomed from the start. The grenadier, with his last dying breath, cursed Ney to die at the hands of who he trusted most. He then looked over the Allied line once again with his telescope to his eye, seeing how little damage the charge had done, seeing the Allied squares along the ridge almost taunting him. As he moves his telescope from the farmhouse to La Haye-Saint, he sees something that surprises him and gives him some hope. In front of the farmhouse, the Allied skirmishers had all assembled in the garden. If he could use the cavalry to chase them away, he can open up a vital position to be occupied, thus giving him some redemption. Without skipping a beat, Wader sends another courier to Travers to gather his troops and to make a charge on the garden. Travers then sends a courier back to the gathered squadrons and orders the remaining men of his squadron to form a line in the row of trees forming a field border. He wisely chose not to involve the 2nd Squadron of the 12th Cuirassiers at risk of them withdrawing once again. The other squadrons eagerly get into position, breaking into a gallop, racing into position for another charge once again after being in a long period of inaction. They make boast and small talk of men going into battle as if they missed the failure of the grand charge. Travers by contrast is silent as he moves into position, ignoring the cheer the men give him as he moves to the head of their formation. He orders his men to draw swords, and the sound of 100 heavy blades occur in an instant. Then he orders the bugler to play the trot. Then suddenly another courier comes rushing urgently with a note in his hand. Both the horse and man had a wild look in their eyes. As the courier arrived, he handed Travers a note from Milhaud that the attack has been called off.
on, Kinder! Get up that hill! Oh God, I don't want to die! I don't want to die! My leg! Jesus Christ, Otto! Don't just stand there and let me bleed to death. Cover this wound and find me a bandsman. My God, I've never seen an assault carrying with so many casualties. Help me up. What? With your leg? I know, damn you. I just want to see these men up close. God. Yeah. Put me up against that tree over there. Bring me one of those guns. I think I'm gonna be sick. Oh God, how am I going to explain this? You treacherous swine! These rifles are marked with British markings! You betrayed us! You are under arrest! No, wait, I can explain! You have precisely 5 seconds before I call the nearest men to arrest you! I have explained to Otto and your commander that I was part of the British Secret Service, and I've been assigned to the Prussian army as we have a double agent in our ranks that has been causing mayhem ever since the Spanish War to stop. Enough! How do you explain these muskets? I've never seen the likes of these before. Probably assigned to these men to ensure their success with so few men. How would a traitor get a hold of these new guns, and what does 1853 mean? It's the year of manufacture. But that's impossible! You're lying! I never said that it did. That's why so many of our agents have been deployed among our forces and our allies during this campaign to capture this man. Did you honestly think that bakery fire was a coincidence? Now this is going to sound absolutely insane, but that man has somehow managed to travel through time, bringing weapons from his generation to help Napoleon for God only knows what reason. So I beg of you, please do not arrest me, at least until we get to the battlefield, after which I will explain everything in true detail. My God, then I apologize, for you must be over your head. We have no time to lose, though. We can talk to this in detail later. We must save Wellington if we have any hopes to defeat that little tyrant. Thinking, oh God, what have I done? How will I explain this to the doctor and get myself out of this?